quiet, quiet. Hit it.
Shoot, I can't. Sorry.
Can't do it.
Here we go.
Oh.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
Countdown for blast off. 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Good evening. Welcome. This is the Autonomous Collective. I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Joe in Norway. I'm with Ann Lee, a retired college professor and community member at the Daily Coast. She's a member of the National Council of Independent Scholars and is a contributor to the book, The Political Economy of Art, Making the Nation of Culture. Evening, Ann.
Hey there, Joe.
Hey,
What's up tonight?
Oh, I got a peck of pickled peppers and butt squash. I'd just like to thank Bruce for that new intro I got working.
Love that intro. Very cool.
Slightly dramatic there. Yeah, so we're pickling tonight. I came across these beauties in the grocery, and I'm all out of pickled jalapeños. So I thought I'd do something in a combination with our famous butt squash. I think Lane was probably jonesing for some sexual innuendo in the meals lately. So we got the chayote squash, which is excellent for pickling. Earlier in the week, I made a quick pickle with it for some sushi rolls I was making. It holds its crunch very well, and it's juicy, and it's just a
Nice.
lovely little thing. I've got some seeds here. I have coriander, pepper, onion seed, or nigella, and some garlic cloves, which I need to our trading post. It doesn't. We have limited selection throughout the week, and some things get a bit old. So we've got the starting to grow. So I need to remove the pips so it doesn't. It's not so bitter. I got a shell out back there as well. So I'll be making a brine out of the brine fermentation. So what we're going to do, we're going to chop up the vegetables. I'm going to de-seed the chilies, and then make boats or segments for the of the chayote and peppers. We'll fill them up. First, we're going to weigh the jar. We're going to fill up the vegetables, add water, and then weigh that volume, so we know what weight we're dealing with. So then we, depending on that weight, we multiply it by 0.025 to 0.03. So 2.5% to 3% solution. I think, James, if you could put up the brine screen, there for people. It's a little handy chart for you. Oh, doxing yourself. Careful there.
All right.
Command F5.
There you go.
There we go. Yeah, so the harder vegetables take a little bit less salt. Oh, it's all up to your taste as well, but the juicier the vegetables, the more salt you need to avoid the baddies. So I like it on the salty side, so we're going to go about 3% solution. So we just chop up the vegetables, add the water in the jar, weigh that, and then do the multiplication. So you could take down the screen there. So I've got I'll pull out my cookbook billfold here. It's my recipe book here. We got it somewhere here. There we go. Just to make sure I got it right here. So pickle. This is a complex formula. I don't know if you can see. All right. So we got vegetable. I wrote it in English so we could all understand it here. Vegetable plus water times the percentage of salt that you need. So we got 0.025 equals salting in grams, right? There we go.
Too much math for me.
So I'll get to prepping. You've got some updates for us on the war on Ukraine.
Indeed. I've got about Ukraine and then a rant a little bit about some poor stand-up comic who, after a year, got his job back. So we'll talk a little bit about that after the break. So,
I had in terms of other scheduling, I was going to speak about a recent study, or I guess a couple studies, meta studies about vegetarians having a conundrum of whether to get enough protein and avoid overly processed foods, or to eat processed foods and get enough protein. So we'll see what this study is looking at. So I thought we could cover that, because one of my stances on the show is to not do any. We do all vegetarian cooking here without any processed foods, or without, aside from flour and things like that, but none of the fake meat products. So I may be wrong about this. I may have to adjust some of my preparations going forward. So we'll see.
well, it does seem like a lot of folks have to adapt, but if one is, sort of fresh forward, I think that's really important.
Fresh forward.
Okay, Ukraine. If I could have the first slide, please. Thanks very much, James. First slide shows, as you can see, the line of contact is there, all the little dots and the blue dots. You have the interactions between the two sides. It's been, on the one hand, a busy week. The losses are about the same. What is, of course, the background against which this is happening is there's some suggestion that there are manpower shortages on the Ukrainian side. The Russians are not so critical in that sense, although it is interesting to see how various the mayor of Moscow seems to have his own paramilitary corporation now. So these are very strange times. Lots of things happening on the Russian side. The Russians decided this past week, as I implied the last time we were here, was starting to ramp up drone and missile attacks. So there's some very serious attacks that have happened during the week, the highest that have been in the war since the beginning. And so it's hovering around 100 some odd missiles a day. They did take a break, I think. There was a slight decline, and then they ramped it up again. It was interesting to see that it was a wide range, almost the complete range of missiles available to them. Some ways it's just like a practice run to see whether they could fire all the missiles at once. And so that did happen. Fortunately, the Ukrainian air defense has been operating somewhere between 70 and 90% of knocking down missiles, incoming missiles. But the problem of incoming missiles, when you intercept them, the debris comes down, and that can cause fires and a variety of injuries. So while there have been some direct, particularly on larger apartment blocks, and they're not firing against mainly military targets, which is always interesting. The Ukrainians tend to the military, although they have been firing precision barrages. They actually assassinated someone in Donetsk by dropping a missile right on the hotel in which they were having a party. So that's probably the difference between the two strategies here. Night before last, or last night, the Ukrainians decided to fire back into Russia, and so a small, volley of missiles landed in Belgorod, which is right on the other side of Kharkiv. So it is sort of interesting to see how that's happening. Some of them are just simply responses to whatever was going on before. So that was the kind of opening of the last week, a series of missile attacks. There are going to be future missile attacks. It's not going to let up. It's the usual places have been attacked, and we don't see any major kind of. We're used to the idea that we could have major incursions, but it seems not to be there. There is a consensus about the relative, we could call it a failure of the, or the lack thereof, of a counteroffensive in the summer, which everyone was hoping for. But I think the reason why it didn't happen was, as I've mentioned before, Russian defenses were better. They had a year to put in, to mine and put in 3 layers of defensive lines in Zaporizhia, and but didn't stop the Ukrainians from taking back Kherson and a variety of other places. So it's kind of even in that particular sense. Some data has come forward that I think it's the Ministry of Defense in the UK has estimated that 70,000 Russians have died. They gave no indication of what the Ukrainian numbers were, but out of 350,000 plus casualties, there are 70,000 Russian. So that's kind of where we are now. The next slide, please. It's been an interesting war. It is weighing on people, I would assert. This is the type of hardware that's being used. As I said, they put up a whole bunch, which means here you can see 8 cruise missiles on, no, they're not cruise missiles. They're actually air-launched ballistic missiles. And they are on those original bombers that were designed to, counter the B-52 nuclear triad threat from the United States, as has been described, bear foxtrots, as they say in the movies. These things are very, very noisy, and if you've ever talked to an American submariner, you can they do verify that you can hear these things underwater. They're very, very noisy. So anyway, they had 15 or so planes launching 8 missiles each, and they were all going all over the place, as I indicated last week. Next slide, please. The counter to that will be air-launched cruise missiles. These are Swedish designs. It's called a Taurus. They're really state of the art. They have stealth technology. They have, low profile and some capabilities to have radar defeat. So they're supposed to be really interesting. They're, and they have good range too. So this is not necessarily a game changer, but it is a munition that has yet to be used. The Germans didn't want to provide them for X number of reasons. The Germans have a lot of issues, I think, on the question of supplying munitions, but they have been stepping up, and the Germans lead the EU in providing monetary support for the Ukrainians. So that's kind of where we are in that thing. But this is a technology that they would like to see, partially, I think, because there's a slight limitation on the French and British cruise missile, which resembles this, slightly smaller, and was used in a lot of precision strikes in Crimea before. So anyway, that's what's coming ahead. I assume that the Ukrainians will have a reasonable kind of response soon. You can see the relative scale of it. These are kind of missiles that can be launched from a variety of airplane platforms. This may be actually one that it can and will be launched from F-16s. I think those were one of the delivery platforms for it in terms of NATO. The F-16s, there's been some speculation that F-16s are already operating in the combat zone, but there's no evidence for it yet. There's nobody actually seeing an F-16 fly through the air in the combat area. But it is true that they've trained multiple numbers of Ukrainian pilots in Denmark and Romania and a whole bunch of other places. So this is the upgrades will be kind of interesting when they have fully sort of combined arms attack, and there will probably be an offensive, and it will probably be somewhere in Zaporizhzhia to try and split the occupied area. And the issue that can't come up this last week is the same one that it's been for 2 years. People want ceasefires, but the ceasefire, if it were to be initiated, would give Russians somewhere between 18 to 20% of Ukraine, and a significant kind of component of the Ukrainian economy. Now, it's not necessarily the case that the Ukrainians can get back. I mean, it is going to take a considerable effort to take back all the land back to, let's say, the 1991 border, or even the 2014 border. But in every case, it has been this problem of to meet force with force. On the Russian side, the same issues have occurred, and there are missile alerts, ships that have been hit. There have been successes as well. Ukrainian shipments of grain, etc., have made it through, so that's an important issue. The Turks are refusing to allow 2 minesweepers that have been transferred from the UK to the Ukrainian Navy. These minesweepers are meant to deal with a lot of sea mines that have been planted by the Russians, which actually struck a ship last week, a commercial ship. So that was interesting as well. Next, please. The other element that has happened in this past week is larger, the KN-23 or whatever it is, the North Korean, that is the DPRK, has sold missiles to the Russians, and the first volley of them have been launched. And you can see the kind of distance on the little there that of the first Russian missiles, and there is actually evidence, markings from the casings, etc., of the North Korean missiles, and this is a sign of things to come. It's not necessary that there's a surplus of North Korean missiles, but since they're not currently fighting a war with anyone, they probably have a certain supply they were willing to give up. In addition to the 1 million artillery rounds that they have sold to the Russians. So those are all there. There's been a side story about failures of the artillery rounds, that they're not well made, and so that you have, failures where it won't fire or whatever. So we'll see whether there are those kinds of issues. The reason why it's so easy for the North Koreans to the Russians is they use generally the same technology in terms of the launchers. So it is interchangeable in that particular sense. Essentially, the North Koreans are making knockoffs of the Caliber missiles and a variety of other Russian ballistic missiles. And since they're launching them from a fair piece away from the border, as you can see, this is it's a problem for the Ukrainians, who have managed to strike in Russia a couple of times. As I said, Volgograd got hit, but it is not as extensive. The Ukrainians never have the same have an equivalent number of missiles to send back. And with every attack, there have been these Iranian drones that are part of every attack. Some of them are just simply sent to crowd the radar, the defensive radar of the Ukrainians. So that's kind of what's going on now that you have soft soil, cold weather. People are hunkered down. The Ukrainians did release a short video that they had some of their special operations forces are actually going into Russia and doing little missions. This one piece that they did show that they were mining roads and doing other sort of insurgent things as on Russian soil, which was sort of interesting. It would be actually one of the never sort of revealed before fact that they've been going into Russia and doing things, which is interesting. Not that the Russians are going to claim that this is an invasion of any kind, but that's kind of what happened. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what's going on. It's about munitions. You can see the numbers here. Just to one site has been visually giving us a sense of how many missiles are being sent. The smaller ones there with the little wings on them are cruise missiles. On the top row is the much larger ballistic or air-launched ballistic missiles. And these are, interesting objects all being thrown around. Needless to say, as I've said, that somewhere between 70 and 80 and 90% of the missiles have gotten intercepted before they get hit anything, but the 20 or 30% that get through do cause damage. There have been some deaths, mainly civilian deaths, but that could be a distortion as well, because the Ukrainians never talk about military casualties, although the numbers in the latter half of this war while at the beginning there were a lot more Russians being taken out of the battle, it creeped up towards the end of last year, and it is unclear how even the losses are. Although if you look at the losses of vehicles, Russians lose twice as many vehicles or more. It just continues. They're losing anywhere from 50 to 100 vehicles a day. Although that's a little distorted too, because the Ukrainians have chosen to hit a lot of different targets. They launch against all kinds of things, and so you'll see videos where people on ATVs, all-terrain vehicles, are targeted, individuals or civilian vehicles that have been commandeered by Russian troops get targeted. It's not quite the same. For the Russians, don't quite do it in that way. So it is a kind of odd set of numbers when you start looking at it from an actual numbers point of view. Next slide, please. Now, I use Chuck Furr's images because I kind of like them. They're available on the internet, and what they do is provide a range of activity that occurs within about a 24-hour period in the battle areas, which are all the same still. It is just simply little areas being taken or given back, and that seems relatively boring and very World War I like, but it's not quite like that. There's considerable artillery. When you see the drone images, there's a tremendous number of holes, potholes, pockmarks in the ground from artillery barrages that go back and forth. Needless to say, when you consider that there's anywhere from a 10 to 25 kilometer range for most artillery that is being used now, a lot of these barrages are obviously you have fire control on these things, and some of them are fired for a counter battery. That is, after somebody shoots something, there's a counter battery radar will identify wherever somebody shot something, and they will try and put munitions ordnance down on that particular spot wherever that gun or launcher is. And so a lot of the back and forth here are counter battery kind of attacks, counterattacks. And they showed one, there's a video of one. It was a multi-million-dollar system, a $250 million system, I think. A Russian component got taken out. And, it's a small victory, but it does have a fairly big effect, considering that they don't have too many of these particular kind of systems on the Russian side. And it is a new technology, things which have only been introduced into the battle in the last couple of months. So that's kind of what's going on. Kupiansk is on the north side of the eastern area, and at the Luhansk side edge. And you can see some of the little areas there. Next slide, please. There's been a use of marine drones, and they've been relatively successful. Unfortunately, I just saw a thing where one of these drones, I think, got captured by the Russians. So there'll be obviously, captured intact. So obviously, there's going to be issues about technology leaking to the other side. The darn thing can go 110 kilometers per hour. So it is, as they've claimed, the fastest thing on the surface in the Black Sea. Also equally interesting, of course, this couple days ago, is the Houthi, who are engaged in the trying to disrupt the Israeli-Gaza war, and launching attacks on a variety of ships in the Red Sea and in the Gulf. The issue with those is that they're starting to use marine drones. This is the first use of marine drones. So and unlike the missiles that they've been flying around and have been gotten intercepted. And you know, you want to think about what the relative cost is. In some cases, using a much more expensive missile to knock down a relatively cheaper drone. So it is, I suppose, a kind of irritation that will necessitate a greater military force to wipe out wherever they're launching drones from. The Houthi are launching, you know, these missile attacks that against various shipping targets. But you know, it was unclear whether they were trying to get them all the way to Israel, which doesn't make much sense. So I think they're mainly meant to attack Israeli shipping. And the problem, and I did mention this a while back, but they tend to have chosen, once they figure out, because every ship has a transponder, they figure out which ship, because the ownership and the flags under which and the crews are all different. And so the Houthi have tried somewhat accurately, but relatively unintelligent, lacking intelligence, have been attacking some ships that have very unclear connections to Israel. And so some ships have just gotten hit because they're just there. But the initial attempt by the Houthi, at least they claim, is that they're only firing at some Israeli connected shipping. The problem is, of course, that now about 20% of global ship traffic goes through the Suez, Red Sea, etc. And a lot of that is being cut back or diverted to go around Africa. So that's causing another issue that hasn't quite come to the fore, a supply chain issue, but that's happening as well. So that's next slide, please. We're almost done. This is pickling is still going on. Joe, you want to talk about pickles?
Sure. I just weighed everything, did the salt calculation, and dissolved the salt in water, so it's outside on the balcony cooling in our -degree temperatures. So I'll be putting the salt mixture back into here, and then we're finished. So very straightforward. Just been sneezing like crazy because of the chili. So
indeed,
these ones.
How cool does the mixture need to be?
I'm gonna just put it in at room temperature, and then this will just sit outside for a couple weeks.
Yes,
Put
it
a
is
little bit
Norway,
of
so it gets cool really quickly.
It'll be fine. And we've got the right salt ratio, so no chance of it going off.
Okay.
Well, there's always chances, I suppose.
Well, on
a question
map,
about Germany and their unwillingness to supply. Was that due to the population not approving, or this is their foreign policy?
It's more about foreign policy, and of course they're trying to be careful, because the real problem, the underlying problem, which doesn't get discussed very often, is the fact that we're in winter, and fossil fuels are still going from Russia to the EU, and it's not that they've fully substituted other sources of oil or natural gas. And this is the problem of the war in general. In other words, Russia gets $1 billion a month or whatever from the EU while this is all going on. So on the one hand, you know, you want to supply the Ukrainians. On the other hand, you worry whether there are going to be delays in delivery of fuel for heating in the winter. So that's a kind of political issue that's going on there.
Regarding the Houthis, I believe I read they are saying up on the ships to identify their lack of relationship with Israel.
Yeah,
That was
some ships, they may be flying a Panamanian flight. In one instance, it was so spurious that it seemed that the owner of the ship may have been somebody Jewish who lived in London, maybe. It was not easily explainable. So, Nate,
third
you had a
cousin
question?
twice removed.
Yeah. Who was this guy again? Chuck, who?
Farrer, Pfarrer. It sounds like a Steve Martin routine, but it's he's a former squad leader for SEAL Team 6, and fancies himself an analyst, which is what
Yes.
is.
So
I
you,
just
yeah,
like his illustrations.
yeah. And you talked about him a little bit earlier in the week, and you said that occasionally that some of his stuff isn't quite accurate. And I was just curious, it's somewhat in general, but this would seem like a good kind of more specific example, how you evaluate that. Like how are you able to make that judgment of when he
Well,
is accurate or not?
Well, I do measure it against. I tend to rely. I'm not on Telegram, which other people are, which is the ultimate verification in terms of there are a lot of what ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, calls mill bloggers. There are people who are situated in particular units who sort of have the trust of some analysts, and they report on some movements. The ISW also says that they try not to do any classified stuff. So, any report we get here is probably slightly dated and not horribly accurate. And a lot of it is sort of after battle stuff. And so what I always assume is that I'm probably 24 hours behind whatever happened. These Chuck's maps here, tend to kind of generally show where there's been an artillery attack or a missile attack, but it's not quite so accurate. And I think he's gone away from identifying particular units. Some people who do these little maps actually try to show specific units, but it's very difficult to know which is what's what on the ground. There used to be a guy who had really good information and had literally every unit figured out, but he doesn't post that much anymore for I'm not sure what reasons. Probably because he was too accurate.
I see. Thank you. That was useful. Thanks.
Sure. This is a map of Donetsk, where I said before they had the Ukrainians dropped a precision bomb on missile on a hotel because they were trying to attack a high value target. You can see here that as I've mentioned before, it's pretty certain that the Ukrainians are not going to take on one of the larger cities in Ukraine that are controlled by the separatists in Donetsk, the People's Republic of Donetsk or whatever. But you can see that Avdiivka is the thing that they're fighting over. It's the area that they're fighting over. But they've been fighting over this area, if you've been following us, for months now. And it is the thing that Putin would like to capture. It's the victory that he would like to see, and it has that. Unfortunately, we have the media frame of Stalingrad, and to sort of compare this. And this slide shows us another example of that. No, you can go ahead.
Oh, really?
The next
Okay.
slide is fine. And thanks, James. Harrison is the the area, sort of the last big area that the Ukrainians took from the Russians. And so you can sort of see that there's still a lot of activity around there. And the dividing line is the Dnieper River, blue line going through here. Nate, you had another question?
Well, yeah, when you said the name Putin, it reminded me of a question I had for you earlier. It's not about the military part, but is there any way to know what's going on with Russian civilians, Russian people's support of Putin, which my understanding before all this was fairly high. Is there any way to know now what's going on with that?
Well, not being a native speaker, it would seem there's a lot of things that are going on that people don't like reporting on or can't report on for a variety of reasons. We got sidelined last week with more attention to artificial intelligence versions of of Putin's image, of deep fakes of his image, but other than that, it's unclear. He's in an election campaign, so to speak, and I suppose he's trying to behave himself and not say anything terribly stupid. He's made a lot of pronouncements. The ISW's analysis essentially shows that, he, in fact, his last major address, he didn't mention Ukraine at all, which was really weird, considering there's a war going on. But he actually didn't mention the war in Ukraine. He was rather framing the entire war as a war between Russia and, quote unquote, the West, because he doesn't want to, obviously admit or reveal that he's not doing that well. Pretty much every day there's massive amounts of disinformation claiming who won, who's winning, and who's not winning. And once you wade through that, it's kind of hard to see actually what's going on. And the reasonable measures of these are, for example, vehicle losses, a variety of casualty reports, the official casualty reports. The Russians actually don't report official casualties either, for all the usual kinds of reasons. They tend to be a little more open about them simply because you can make some analysis from the disinformation they crank out for whatever reason, for official reasons or unofficial reasons. And as I said, the ISW has a lot of embeds in the in various units that they trust for information that can or can't be verified. The ISW, for example, always puts a little disclaimer at the end of the Millblogger report to say, well, the ISW hasn't verified this particular thing. So they'll put the claim in and then say, well, we haven't really looked in to see this, but this is a kind of, that's the information space, as they say. Next slide, please. So this is the ISW did do an analysis. Oh, this is the end slide. I see. Okay, I should stop anyway because it's ranting time. I did essentially the ISW did a big report showing what the current state of the battle lines are, and this is what Nova Russia would look like if a ceasefire were declared today. And you can see that the darker red zones are what were there before the war started, and these bigger pink areas are the areas that essentially Russia will have gained from their 2-year war, if the lines were frozen at the current position, which is what may actually happen, considering all of the issues that and some of us, were kind of more optimistic about whether there was going to be a major counteroffensive in this big pink area in the middle to drive the Russians apart, the two areas apart. So the goal has always been for for Russia to try and claim the entire coastal line. And so they've achieved at least the unification of the Donetsk area, occupied area, and taken over the Zaporizhzhia, part of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, and Kherson to connect the lower left there, which is Crimea. Next slide, please. And so some of us would hope at the end, this is a hypothetical map, but ultimately, if the Ukrainians were successful to drive the Russians completely back, and if the UN would get off their rear, this is what it should look like, that there should be a demilitarized zone, between Russia and Ukraine that would last for a decade or more. Because this is the only way that you're going to prevent some major incursions from the Russians to fiddle with the Ukrainians, and that would be the kind of hope that we would have. That's the end of my little slide thing. And so rant-wise, I'm not going to show it. Well, maybe we will show the routine. It's all right. We won't. My little rant is about a guy named Jad, Jads, Jad S. And Jad S is a stand-up comic, but he's also a producer and reporter for WHYY in Philadelphia, the NPR station, NPR National Public Radio station. And he's been working at home primarily. He was working at home during the COVID period, but he was also doing a little stand-up once things began to lift a little. I think the people at NPR at WHYY were irritated that he was able to be at home and continued. He had an excuse because he has multiple sclerosis, but he was also doing gigs, and which probably irritated his bosses. So I'm assuming that's what the issue was. But they discovered that because he posts his stand-up stuff, his comedy stuff on the proverbial internet, like on Instagram and YouTube, I think they just didn't like him being successful. But the fact is, it didn't interfere with his. It didn't seem to interfere with his work. He got decent job performance stuff, at least up to November 2022. But ultimately, they were unhappy, and so therefore they decided to fire him rather unceremoniously in I think January of 2022. And needless to say, he lost his health insurance and whatever. And it seems that he's hoping to be a stand-up, I suppose. He's an Arab American, a veteran. Had done at least one tour as a Marine. Served in Iraq. Not in combat, I think, in the post-combat period. But anyway, they attempted to fire him, so he did a wrongful death thing, wrong firing complaint. Lawyers were involved. SAG-AFTRA supported him, gave him lawyers to support his activity there. So you could see that there's a lot of issues going on. So 12 months later, he's been reinstated. It's just interesting because he was reinstated because this is stuff he was doing on the side, except that WHYY fired him because it violated their social media policy. Well, yes and no, but unfortunately, from the arbitrator and this went through arbitration, and they weighed in on the side of Jad Sleeman. He's been doing the gig at WHYY for 5 years, so it would seem that he has a relative moral tenure, as they say. But some people were probably thin-skinned. It's clear that he does controversial humor, some of which is about being an Arab American, which if you've seen the general genre, you know that it's going to comment about all the cultural differences. And but none of these things are, I mean, they test of questions of difference. Let's put it that way. Intersectionality. It's fine. It's not. It's not that extreme. But somebody decided it was offensive, and they tried to fire him. So anyway, he's back. He's at least gotten his job back, which is really good. After a year, which we can just all imagine what would happen if we were, from our gig for a year. And as particularly if you were trying to rely on being a stand-up for 12 months during a period where, we were still getting out of COVID, etc. So we'll see. I'm sure there were other issues, but he did succeed. So that's a useful thing. Anyway, that's my little rant for tonight. I hope you'll consider going to either one of his shows or taking a look at what he has online. It's fairly funny stuff, and it's not, it's more about observations about, what about his family. Has observational stuff, makes fun of his mom, and talks about dating and etc. So it's pretty much a standard stand-up fare with, the proviso that it is a sort of stuff. So it has that kind of element in it, and it's not as edgy as some other comics. Partially because he knows sort of what the range and limits are for intersectional humor at this moment in time. But anyway, that was my little rant, and now I see the pickles are in the jar.
We're all sorted. I forgot the shallots, so I did those at the end. But we've got shallot, garlic, jalapeños, and chayote, aka butt squash, in a 3% salt solution, and we'll leave this for a couple weeks, and they should be tasty. Natural fermentation. Put it in the refrigerator after a couple weeks. But one thing I wanted to talk about, a couple weeks back, or December 20th, New Scientist published an article entitled "Vegans Who Avoid Ultra-Processed Food Risk Being Protein Deficient."
Yes, I remember.
Two relatively recent dietary trends, veganism and concerns about highly processed foods, may be in conflict with each other. So this happens all the time. For some reason, the science journalists love to, well, maybe not the science journalists, maybe it's the editorial staff. They love to make these claims. They always stress the severe risk for vegetarians on protein intake, when largely we generally way too much protein. But this is based off of a meta study that was off of a meta study out of Brazil, that was based off of a study in France, where they're analyzing people's behavior in dietary consumption. Just let me, as opposed to, let's see where we go. I just wanted to, rather than going to the New Scientist, I'd rather just go straight to the research paper, which has a slightly different title: "Consumption of Ultra-Processed Foods by Pesco Vegetarians, and Vegans, Associations with Duration and Age at Diet Initiation." basically they're finding that vegetarians eat ultra processed foods, the earlier they are in becoming a vegetarian, and over long term they tend to essentially eat better, more balanced meals. But the background is that there is a growing availability of industrial plant-based meat and dairy substitutes that can be classified as ultra-processed foods, UPFs for short. Very little is known about the consumption of UPFs by vegetarians. So the objective of the study, the aim of this cross-sectional study from the Nutrinet Santé cohort was to describe the contribution of UPFs to different vegetarian diets in relation to the nutritional quality of their diet and determinants of UPF consumption, including duration and age at vegetarian diet initiation, meaning when they became vegetarian. The study was 21,212 people divided into 4 groups. There was 19,812 meat eaters, 646 pesco-vegetarians. They just call those pescatarians. 500 vegetarians and 254 vegans. Their daily food intakes were collected using repeated 24-hour dietary records. Vegetarian diets were described by the proportion of energy from UPFs. This is the ultra-processed foods, and the nutritional quality of the diet using healthy and unhealthy plant-based diet indices. In a subsample without meat eaters, multivariable linear regression, blah, blah, blah. The results, basically, higher avoidance of animal-based foods was associated with higher consumption of UPFs. So basically, you're more likely, if you're a vegetarian, you're more likely to eat these ultra-processed foods than the other ones. The nutritional quality of the diets was also associated with the level of animal-based food avoidance with healthy PDIs. That's the plant-based diet indice. At 53.5 to 63.6, 61.3 and 67 for meat eaters, pescatarians, vegetarians, and vegans. Short duration and young age at diet initiation were associated with the increased consumption of UPFs. Their collecting the data was done with every 6 months. Participants of the cohort were requested to complete 3 consecutive 24-hour dietary records for 1 weekend day and 2 weekdays via an interactive interface on the website. Information on each food and beverage consumed during the 3 main meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and any snacks was collected. So the results.
Is this the Brazil? Is this the Brazil?
This is the one in front. This is the French one.
Oh,
so
okay.
the Brazilian one was based off of this. So out of a total of 21,212 participants were included in the final sample, there were, we already went over those. Women represented 73.1%. The mean average was 56.3 years of age. About a third of the sample was overweight or obese. Half were smokers or smokers. Most participants had a high educational level. 69.4% were at least undergraduates, and high income, 35.2%, earn more than 2,700 euros monthly household income. Participants were primarily couples with children, and my alarm just went off. Compared to meat eaters, vegetarians, all types combined, were more often younger individuals and women, except for the vegans, where the proportion of women was similar to meat eaters. The more individuals avoided animal-based foods, the more likely they were to have a moderate or high level of physical activity, have a higher level of educational attainment, live alone without children, and to have lower BMI compared to the other types of groups in the diet. Lower income vegans had lower incomes and were more often self-employed, manual workers, or unemployed. So,
That's interesting.
yeah. In our sample, vegetarians and especially vegans took a higher proportion of energy from UPFs, this is the ultra-processed foods, than meat eaters, with most of the industrial plant-based meat and dairy substitutes created for these specific diets belonging to that food category. In addition, while vegetarians and vegans seem to have the highest proportions of individuals favoring healthy plant-based foods, they also had the highest frequency of individuals favoring unhealthy plant-based foods. Finally, a low duration and younger age at diet initiation were associated with a higher consumption of UPFs. These results provide new knowledge on the consumption of UPFs and unprocessed foods by vegetarians and vegans. Only a few studies have addressed consumption of UPFs in this type of population, and none used indices to distinguish the degree of food processing. So vegetarian diets were described in many studies as having beneficial health effects due to their high nutritional quality. In the present analysis, we showed that vegetarians and vegans were the highest consumers of UPFs and consume more industrial plant-based meat and dairy substitutes. The association between vegetarian diets and intake of UPFs was still significant after controlling for socioeconomic and other lifestyle variables, such as physical activity. Following one of these types of diet may thus lead to higher intake of UPFs and unprocessed foods, independently of the effect of some socioeconomic characteristics such as age or income. We hypothesize that a higher intake of processed form of plant-based foods might reduce or cancel their potential benefit health effects based on the results of previous studies. In our study, vegetarians had higher mean unhealthy PDIs, implying that most of them preferred unhealthy products to healthy products. Vegetarians or vegans follow a diet with a higher contribution of UPFs could have the same risk of developing health problems as non-vegetarians. Persons who had started a vegetarian diet or vegan diet more recently were more likely to eat more UPFs than those who started longer ago. This may be explained by the fact that vegetarian diets seem to include healthier plant-based food over time. Increased knowledge of nutrition and how to balance a vegetarian diet over time may lead to a gradual replacement of UPFs by unprocessed foods. So that's common. I've found that as well. Some friends of mine I made when I moved to Las Vegas for the previous 3 years had been living on peanut butter sandwiches and ramen noodles without adulterating the ramen noodles. Even I don't know how they didn't even have scurvy. I was blown away.
God.
Just crazy. But a lot of this has to do with just, not knowing what to replace things with if you're making that change. If you haven't grown up with a vegetable heavy diet. But yeah, so this study was much less direct in the Scientific American one that is ultimately coming from, which was vegans who avoid ultra-processed food risk being protein deficient.
John has
Yep, John.
John Hayes has a question.
Yeah, as always, I guess I wonder who financed this research. That could be a clue. I've noticed in the past.
I'll post some links to everything
I
afterwards.
did read some of that article, and it even admits something that was kind of connects with all this anyway. Obviously, is that seems like it's implying that a lot of people who eat processed fake meat are earlier in their veganism, which makes sense. And the idea of it is that it's one reason fake meat exists is to make it easier for people who want to stop eating meat, to make them transition, because they'll still have that thing that kind of reminds them of the meat that they've given up. And after a while, me, 13-year vegan here, and I haven't had beef or poultry or pork for 27 years. I was a pescatarian for 13 years, and then I went vegan. Anyway, I have less craving for it. Definitely, I can do without it more often than not, but I will once in a while indulge in having some of this fake meat stuff. And it depends on which ones you buy too, how processed they are and what ingredients they have in them. But
yeah,
the average American,
I didn't mind corn, the Michael protein.
oh, the British one,
that was growing out the back step of the lab.
Yeah.
Scrape that off, turn that into a product.
You're talking about the fake meat that's, I think it's based in the UK. It begins with a Q instead of a C.
Q,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, they don't sell it here, I don't think.
Okay, yeah, maybe
which,
the FDA has an issue.
Lane has a question as well. Speaking
Yes,
of the
sir.
UK.
Go ahead, Lane.
Yes, Lane.
No, who does? Wait a second. Mine wasn't. No. Oh, Nate had another
Nate.
question. That's what it was. Sorry.
Hey, Joe.
Hey.
Yeah, my question is, although just on a qualitative cuisine enjoyment level, clearly whole foods are better, but beyond that,
You mean Whole Foods? The
no,
word
not
Whole
the
Foods,
store,
not the company.
not the store. No,
Not to be confused with Whole Paycheck.
The foods that you make, for instance. But unless I missed it, nothing you shared about this study said anything about longevity and disease rate. So, in other words, I'm asking, well, so what if people want to eat UPFs?
Yeah, well, they mentioned it up top that there's little data on the long-term effects of these products, and they are relatively new to some degree. One thing I could point out, in Israel, for example, Tival is a company. They work in the settlements. Don't buy the food products, but they, for many years, decades, going back, can't remember when they started, quite early, they were providing all variety of vegetarian-based foods that have only come out in the past 10, 15 years here. So that had to do with there not being a lot of land in Israel, and meat is expensive. So, and also the kosher restrictions. So people were more likely to go for the meat alternatives. So I found that there was less of a hang up around people adopting these non-meat, fake meat products. But again, we don't know what the long-term effects are. They're largely, essentially, hydrolyzed soy, all variation of gluten, forms of gluten, and binding agents. So they can't control the quality, but essentially it's gluten and some form of soy to achieve the textures.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
But what the main argument that I have against them is that they're corporate, number one. So you're not in control of what's going in, and you're promoting a kind of corporate food production. and it prevents you from learning how to just use actual real food.
Yeah, I know.
can understand that.
And they're
It's just
expensive.
I
Quite
can
expensive.
understand.
They can be.
Now, there's
Here
two
they're
things.
Well,
extremely
I
expensive.
would say that in my experience, the price differential is really important. It does seem to me that UPS stuff is twice as expensive generally than what it's substituting for.
Yeah, but remember, we've talked about this before. Speaking of substitution and subsidies for meat and dairy, which
Yes.
is
Oh,
it
yes,
would
of
cost
course.
several times as much as it costs for meat and dairy if you actually pay the real price that you should be paying for it without the subsidies and the effect it has on the climate and pollution in general and blah blah blah, and land it takes over. But there's a couple of factors when people complain. As I think I heard in the statistics you mentioned of the people that they study for this, people with lower income were more often vegan and vegetarian in this study.
Yeah, that was curious.
Well, that
and
belies
and to
that
have no
belies-
job as well.
That belies the ongoing thing, which Ann just added into, is that it's too expensive to be a vegan. I'm always going, what the hell are you talking about? Vegetables and fruit and grains are more expensive than meat. Meat is always even when it's subsidized, it still costs more to get something with meat in it. At the restaurants, they add something to it, like add fish, add this, add this. It's another $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 added to what would be a vegetarian or vegan dish typically. And
Well, if you're living
buying
in a
stuff
food
in
desert
restaurants,
situation, that could be
yes, I
quite
know.
different
Okay, we've talked about this a million
economic
times. I'm not talking about people who have no options. I'm talking about people who
Yeah.
have the choice, which is probably almost everybody in this chat. So that's not an excuse. That don't turn it over to somebody who you have no connection with or who doesn't exist in this group. Or the average listener, or the average American who can afford to have any, and it's not expensive anyway. I keep saying that. It's just fruit and vegetables. And
Prof.
grains,
John has a question.
beans.
Beans.
If you're buying the expensive stuff, you're buying the stuff you don't want to eat anyway, which is this processed food. So you're better off without it.
Magical fruit. John?
Yes, John.
Yes, so I don't find the study surprising. I'm inclined to believe it. I think part of the problem is that people don't know how to cook, and they're relying on restaurants, they're relying on takeout, they're relying on frozen food or food that's been made by supermarkets, ready to eat meals.
Prepared meals, yeah.
So that's really a problem, because the corporations, as you pointed out, Joe, have no interest in your health. The corporations that make these foods, what they have interest in is maximizing the sales of these foods, and if it tastes good, profit. Imagine that.
I have to thank you, John, for getting us back on point. That is the whole point of this every Friday evening, making 100% vegetarian meals from scratch, under an hour, with no fake meat products, and very simple recipes, or mostly simple recipes.
Well, let me make another point. While we may not know the negative effects of this processed food for now, because it's kind of in an early stage, we definitely know the negative effects of eating meat and dairy products. From the vast majority of Americans, certainly, and other countries, definitely, the rate of unhealthy humans in general and they're not vegans or vegetarians. They're people who eat meat and dairy products and processed foods too.
Yeah.
This study was also done in France. So vegetarians in France are quite a marginal group. But one thing I would have liked to see in the study is what percentage of the diet, the vegetarian diets, are made up of these ultra processed foods. That's the real thing to tease out there, I think. But they had many caveats in there. There were some limitations and strengths. They say, to our knowledge, this is the first study to consider the consumption of plant-based meat and dairy substitutes, and the first to assess the contribution of unprocessed foods and ultra-processed foods to the diet of vegetarians and vegans in relation with diet quality indices, duration of the diet, and age at vegetarian diet initiation. Some limitations of our study must be stated. First, like many epidemiological studies, participants of the cohort were volunteers. There was a probable selection bias because willing participants could have been more health conscious. Some differences between the included and excluded participants were observed, indicating another potential selection bias. In addition, the population was not representative of the entire French population in terms of socio-demographic characteristics, a high proportion of women and retired persons. Caution is therefore needed in generalizing these results to the overall French population. However, this study with a large sample size allowed us to study individual behaviors such as vegetarian diets that are relatively rare in the general population.
Nancy has a question.
Hey, Nancy.
Yeah, I missed some of the conversation, but I never really believed that everybody needs to eat the same things. Like an individual could have different dietary needs. So, I understand about excluding meat, but to say that eating meat is categorically unhealthy, there are just too many factors, about the source of the meat. Is it farmed or wild? What was the diet of the animal? And proportionally, how much meat is a person including in their diet? How is it prepared? And the same goes for any other category of ingredient. And what does the individual person need at their stage of life for their, there was some people said that your diet should relate to your blood type. So I don't know if that's been debunked or
it's been debunked.
Okay, so, but there could be other physiological needs depending on the individual body as to what would constitute the best diet for a person. So, I don't think we could just make blanket statements. But if you're talking about what you're eating, if it's nutritious and fresh and so on, there are these certain basics that would contribute to a healthy diet. But it's not like a
baseline needs, such as B12. That was the main criticism against the vegan diet.
Yeah, well, that's easily solved.
Yeah, I take supplements, and in nature it wouldn't be a problem because B12 is like in soil, and people, in more primitive times, they would get B12 just from eating. They could eat vegetables and get it from the soil that's still on the roots or whatever, without cleaning it like we do now. That's one of the problems. And then the animals that people get B12 in, beef and other products, sometimes that's usually synthetic, or it's given to the animals while they're in the factory farming situation. So it's not even that they have it themselves, it's put into them. So why not just put it into yourself and skip the middle. Well, I can't say middle man, the middle animal, I suppose.
Right. Or you could, there are microbial sources, which is why nutritional yeast is popular in vegetarian diets for one reason.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to be aware and take responsibility for your dietary choices, then, the optimization of the ingredients that you put into your diet is going to be something that you think about. It's just not,
Right.
the standard
combining
way of
101.
looking at it.
But now you're talking about people who are actually care, I guess, or are knowledgeable about health and dietary needs that they have. But again, most people in this country obviously don't give a fuck about their health and their diet based on what you see and what they eat. So.
I'm not going to say most people anything, but yes, a lot of people just say, "Ooh, does it taste good?" And that's the end of the, the criteria that you're using.
And at least 90,
either way.
I think 97% or maybe more of the meat that Americans consume is not animal friendly. It's not, free range or real. Free range is kind of a hoax of sorts anyway.
Well,
and
any really good
factory farmed, most of it, 95
not
plus
over
percent.
over 95%.
Yep.
Well, a lot of those foods are also fortified with the same products that you're seeing here.
Like B12 and antibiotics is another problem.
They're
Too many
fortified with
antibiotics
soy. Soy is used as filler. Soy and gluten and all those things are.
Yeah, most of the soy
added
goes
to
to farmed animals instead of people. People say, "Oh, you vegans, you vegetarians, you have all these crops for soy and corn." And no, the vast majority of that goes to animals that you eat, not me.
Well, either way, whatever the situation is, I don't know. What we're looking at doesn't look the most appealing to me
Right.
personally.
And I, along those lines, I want to say many of us here adore the food you make. So just on an aesthetic level, if you were microwaving Hot Pockets, I don't think any of us would tune in.
Well,
Come on, I want a factory farmed Hot Pocket.
Ooh.
Well, this photograph really makes whatever it is look pretty disgusting. However, if you got yourself a nice vat of hot oil and fried all these things up and arranged them, and it will look delicious.
Not enough lard.
Proper sear marks and slice them nicely.
Get a
Lord
nice
almighty.
a burger bun and some ketchup and a lettuce leaf on it, and it would look very nice.
Very yummy.
Garnish is 95% of the work.
I wonder what food in the Twilight Zone tastes like.
Well, but maybe
Excuse me.
this is about as far I've made seitan, the wheat gluten from just wheat and water. But this is a typical processed food called TVP, or texturized vegetable protein. It's the freeze-dried mince. This predates the stuff you get now in the freezer section. It says no flavoring, basically. So it absorbs whatever you season it with.
He likes
possibly to
seitan
do
so much. He likes seitan so much, some call him a seitan worshiper.
I was wondering when you get to that.
That would be your vegetarian kibble.
Woof.
I don't think my dog would eat.
Maybe we'll do something with this. This is the most produced we'll get.
I do have a comment here. For terms of public policy, obviously, what I think we need to do is to help accelerate the development of lab-grown meat, because I think that's the only way you're going to get the majority of Americans to stop eating dead animals.
You and your bloody Star Trek.
I agree.
And what I would do is I would subsidize that development, and I would slowly take away the subsidies for meat as that ramps up. So, I think in terms of getting everyone or almost everyone off of tortured and murdered animals, this is the most likely way of doing it.
Well, it's also a geographic problem, I would suggest, John, as well, because isn't a lot of it is about process, right? As well, factory meat does, tend to include more preservation issues or whatever. So I think it has to come in combination with more slow food or localized sourcing, right?
Yeah, I mean, every region and country should be able to produce their own lab-grown meat. So that should be something that we should.
Well, it's a scale issue. I'm just saying that at some moment, capitalism-wise, when you go at scale, you need to it over centralizes sources, right, for production, which require more transportation, which requires more fossil fuel, which et cetera, et cetera.
3D
unless we've got whole neighborhoods full of skyscrapers, full of sheep pans of flesh.
What?
But again, similarly with the ultra processed foods, the fake meat issue, you're running into the long-term health effects that we have no clear understanding of. So that would also hinder adoption as well.
And with packaging is the other issue. I would assert if we can somehow reduce packaging, we'd do a lot as well.
Well, on that note, I believe we've got the Twilight Zone coming up shortly.
Yeah.
Any teasers or no spoilers?
We got neo-Nazis.
Hey.
Yay!
Well, package them up.
Oh, no, not this one.
Neo-Nazis, fun.
That's not a Twilight Zone for you.
Well, that's just the thing.
There we go.
Yeah, unfortunately, this episode has the relevance of it has increased rather than decreased.
Well, after the Twilight Zone, we'll do some news. People can read whatever articles and can discuss what they find interesting. And at midnight, I was going to show a talk from the recent Chaos Conference in Hamburg, hacker conference. There was an interesting talk on synthetic sentience. Can artificial intelligence become conscious?
You're doing it again. I need to go to
I'm
bed.
sorry. This will be fun and enjoyable for everyone who enjoys everybody who enjoys parsnips and a fine wine.
You know what? It gets to about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I start going to myself, you do realize, Lynn, about 20 years ago, you could stay up and drink all night for a weekend. You could not. Now you can, come on. I actually have to motivate myself to stay up.
Oh,
Swine. Told you before. After 4 a.m. GMT, everything must be boring.
Well, it's not guaranteed. Maybe we could do it in the afternoon. Tomorrow afternoon.
I need
Sorry, Toby. Repeat what this is.
It's a talk on synthetic sentience. Can artificial intelligence become conscious? If you go to the link in the chat to the schedule,
Alive!
put
It's
a little.
alive!
So, despite the rapid progress of AI capabilities, the core question of artificial intelligence seems to be still unanswered. What does it take to create a mind? Let us explore the boundaries of AI sentience, self-awareness, and the possibility of machine consciousness. And it goes on.
And this is
Quite
going
an
to be a
interesting
more
talk by
interesting.
Josh. Huh?
This is going to be more interesting than that talk about tech security and stuff.
Oh, that one was
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
very good, but this will be a little bit more accessible.
Okay,
Well,
because I don't
otherwise,
want to be
It's
I don't want to be harsh, but you know that video could have bored the shine off a billiard ball.
This one just might melt your mind.
just just look at the very topic, Prof. John.
We'll be covering a lot of ethical issues.
And
That's good.
and
Yeah,
then why
John,
aren't
you dick.
you reading the schedule? Why aren't you reading the schedule, Prof. John?
Why am I what?
Well, as a main contributor to this whole show, why aren't you reading the schedule?
Come see us next week.
Yeah.
Come see us next week. We're outroing
We'll see you.
after hours. It's Twilight Zone time.
It's